Let's start our discussion on Introduction to Network Security. Network security is about protecting your system from threats, intentional threats and unintentional threats. Intentional threats could include a person trying to maliciously damage your hardware or software or data, or someone trying to steal confidential data. That's intentional threats, where somebody is trying to damage your system in one way. And often in security, we only think of intentional threats. We only think of bad guys trying to break in. But another type of threat is unintentional threats, such as a power loss or hardware failure. Our job as a network technician is to mitigate those threats. There are 5 general categories or 5 levels of security: login security, file security, network or over-the-wire security, internet security, and physical security. Let's start out with login security. Login security is also called authentication security because to be authenticated means to be logged on. And the risk that we're talking about is that an unauthorized person logs into our network. So to lower the probability that a bad guy gets in, there are a couple things we can do. We can require that everybody has to have a password and it has to have a certain length. Require that everyone change his or her password every 90 or every 180 days. Enable account lockout and restrict allowed login times. Let's start out with require password length. To configure these security parameters, we configure the security policy using the GPO. GPO stands for Group Policy Object, and the Group Policy Object is a configuration file which sits on the domain controller and which affects all users and all computers in the domain. So let's configure the group policy. If I go into the group policy editor and I go into security settings and I go into account policies and I go into password policy, we can see that we can configure the minimum password length. We can require that every user has a password, and we can specify that it's 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 characters long. The longer the password is, the more secure it will be. We can also require a maximum password age, whereby we can require the user to change his or her password every 90 days or every 180 days. And the more frequently we make the user change it, then the more secure the system will be. And another variable we can configure is account lockout policy. And one thing that bad guys will do is that they will just guess and guess and guess a password 1,000,000 times until they get it. So what we can do is we can configure the account lockout policy where it says account lockout threshold. If we can configure that, we can configure the account lockout threshold such that if a bad guy is guessing passwords and he gets the password wrong 5 times in a 30-minute period of time, then that account will be locked for a certain period of time, such as 24 hours or even permanently. That's account lockout policy. And then another variable we can configure is the time of day when users can and can't log in. If I go to my user account properties here for my user Bob White, and under the login hours, I can configure it so this user can only log in from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. Another category or a level of security is securing access to data. Who can access what? And the threat is that unauthorized users get access to confidential data. For example, we don't want just anybody accessing the payroll database. Only people who are accountants should be able to access the payroll database. And this allows us to authorize access to files and folders. And we do that using NTFS permissions. NTFS stands for New Technology File System. And NTFS permissions allows us to assign users or groups permissions to certain files. For example, the payroll database file. Here's a payroll database file. If I right-click on it, select Properties, and go into Security, I can configure it such that the accountants group, and only accountants group, has permissions to it, and then they have the permission to modify and to read and write to the payroll database, just the accountants group, not just anybody. When we're talking about NTFS permissions, we have three variables to consider. What file are we talking about? Which people are going to have access, and what level of access are we going to give them? And here's one example, which would be the inventory database at a place like Home Depot. We want everybody to be able to see what's in the inventory database. So what we would do is we would assign the group everyone access to the inventory database, but we would just give the read permission. Read permission means they can see what's there, but they can't change it. And then, here's another example. Take the file, the payroll database. You don't want just everybody to have access to it. Typically, the only people who are going to have access are going to be people who are members of the accountants group, and then the only permissions we would give them would be the read and the write permissions, so they could modify and they could update payroll, but only the accountants group. And then all files, of course, administrators, that's us, are going to have full control to all files, but only administrators are going to have full control to all files. NTFS permissions specify who can access which files. Now let's discuss the concept of encryption. And we have a couple of examples: EFS, the encrypted file system, and IPSec. So let's start out with EFS. EFS, the encrypted file system, allows us to encrypt files which are sitting on the hard disk, and it protects us against the threat of a lost or stolen hard disk or lost or stolen portable computer. To configure EFS, it's real easy. I'll just go to the file which I want to encrypt, such as the inventory database file. I right-click on that. Under Properties, I select General. I click on the Advanced button, and then I simply click on the checkbox that says Encrypt Contents to Secure Data. And when I do that, it encrypts files which are sitting on the hard disk, and that protects against a lost or stolen hard disk. Now, another security threat that we are faced with is eavesdropping or wiretapping, and that's where a bad guy uses a protocol analyzer to steal credit card numbers and passwords. As you know, a protocol analyzer is a program that somebody can use to tap into the wire, and it allows them to listen to all packets which go over the wire. And a bad guy could use a protocol analyzer to steal credit card numbers or passwords which are being sent over the wire. So what we do is we use encryption. IPSec is a protocol short for TCP/IP secure, and what it does is it encrypts data which is going over the wire. To enable IPSec, we just go into the group policy editor, and then under IPSec policies on local computer, we select the policy that encrypts IP traffic, and we simply enable that policy, and that encrypts data which is sent between workstations and servers, data which is being sent over the wire. IPSec versus EFS. What's the difference? Well, they both encrypt data, but EFS, encrypted file system, encrypts data which is stored on the hard disk, and it protects against lost or stolen hard disk. But IPSec encrypts data which is going over the wire, and it protects us against a bad guy with a protocol analyzer. A VPN, a virtual private network, is a methodology of encrypting data which is going over the internet. So here's the example. We have users who are at home and they want to connect to the corporate network at work. But to be protected against bad guys with protocol analyzers, they use the VPN. And what the VPN does is it encrypts all data which is sent over the internet from the users to the corporate network, so that way if there is a bad guy with a protocol analyzer tapping into the wire, it's not going to do him any good because all communication is encrypted. This is an example of individual users. Now, here's another example of a virtual private network. This is a site-to-site virtual private network. It connects one office to another office by way of the internet, and all data sent between the two offices is encrypted. They call it a virtual private network because it allows us to send private data over the public internet. Another threat that we face is intrusion from the internet. That is unwelcome, unwanted incoming internet traffic. And that's the purpose of the firewall, to block unwanted incoming internet traffic. A firewall is a piece of software that's used to block unwanted traffic. And it can be installed and configured on a router, or on a server, or on an individual workstation. To enable the firewall, we go to Control Panel. We go into Control Panel to System and Security, and we select Windows Firewall and click on Windows Firewall. And then we can see that Windows Firewall is not currently enabled, so I click on Turn Windows Firewall on or off. And we can see that Firewall is not enabled. So I'll select the radio buttons that say Turn on Windows Firewall. I click on OK, and now I can see that the firewall is currently turned on. So now that the firewall is enabled, that is going to block all incoming internet traffic except return traffic. The purpose of the firewall is to block unwanted incoming traffic. Well, suppose you do want to allow certain types of traffic to come into your network. For example, suppose you do want people to come into your network to access your web server. In that case, we use a firewall rule. The purpose of a firewall is to allow or to block traffic. A firewall rule is an if-then statement that's used to allow or block traffic. For example, if port number 80, which means web traffic, then allow. So let's look at an example of enabling a firewall rule using Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. We go into Control Panel, into System and Security, and under Administrative Tools we select Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. And then we select Inbound Rules, and here's a firewall rule right here for Worldwide Web Services. It's enabled, and if I right-click on that rule and select Properties, we can see that the action, that what this rule is going to do is to allow traffic. And if we look at the description, we can see that it is an inbound rule to allow HTTP traffic for TCP port 80. And if we click on the tab that says Ports and Protocols, it shows that it's going to allow traffic from port number 80. So what do you mean by port number 80? What is a port? A port is a field in an IP header that identifies the destination, program, or service that the packet is going to. To review, as you know, an IP packet has both data information and header information. And the header includes the IP address and the port number. The IP address is the address of the computer that the packet is going to. And the port number identifies the program on that computer that the packet is going to. So if it is port number 80, then it is web traffic. It's port number 1, then it is FTP traffic. A firewall typically allows or disallows traffic based upon port number. So a firewall rule is an if-then statement that allows or disallows traffic based upon port number or upon IP address. Here are two examples. One firewall rule might say, if port number 80, then allow, and that would allow web traffic. Or another port rule might say, if source network equals 10.25.0.0, then deny, and that would deny all traffic from that particular network. Malware. Malware is bad software. Mal means bad, such as malfunction, and malware is bad software. Software that's going to damage your computer or your data or your programs, such as a virus or a Trojan horse or spyware or a worm or a bot. And to combat malware, we use anti-malware software. And there are many different types of anti-malware software out there. McAfee, for example, is currently the #1 anti-malware software in the field. And then Norton is also very well, it's #2 in the field, and that's antivirus software or anti-malware software as well. And there are many of them out there. And another one is Microsoft Security Essentials. And let's look at Microsoft Security Essentials. I've got Microsoft Security Essentials running on this computer, and what I can do is scan my computer for viruses. So I click on Scan, and then it proceeds to scan my computer and look for viruses, and then it shows no threats were detected on your computer during this scan. And that's Microsoft Security Essentials. So malware is software that can damage your computer, and our job as network technicians is to ensure that anti-malware software is installed on all of our computers. Wireless security. When we configure wireless security, we have a couple key variables to configure. One is we disable service set identifier broadcasting, so the wireless router doesn't broadcast, so not just anybody can connect to it. We enable encryption on both the wireless router as well as the wireless workstation, and we enter a passphrase. The same passphrase is typed in to the wireless router as well as to the wireless workstation. And if we want to, we can configure MAC address filtering, and that's where we configure the wireless router to only allow specific workstations to connect based upon the MAC address. Auto update. Auto update is a feature of Windows that downloads operating system patches from Microsoft's update server, and the purpose of these patches is to allow the operating system to run more smoothly, to correct any errors in the operating system. And auto update also downloads security patches, and the security patches close any holes which may be in security. To configure auto update, we go to Control Panel, System and Security, Windows Auto Update, and we select Change Settings. And what we can do is we can configure it such that every day at 3 a.m. our workstation can contact Microsoft Update Server and download any updates for the operating system. Physical security. You can have all the passwords that you want on your servers, but if there's not a lock on the server room, then a bad guy could just walk into the server room, pick up a server, carry it away, and crack it at his leisure. That's why it's important to have a lock on the server room. Also, it's important to have air conditioning in the server room such that the servers don't overheat. And a UPS box, uninterruptible power supply, is designed to give power to the servers in case the power goes out in the building. Backups. A backup is where we copy all of the data which is on the hard disk of the server to a tape backup. And the reason we do this, the risk, is because the hard disk or the server could crash at any time. So typically we back up to tape. Now, another thing we could do is do an off-site backup, which is a backup to cloud, and that would protect us against the threat of the entire building burning down, backup tapes included. In summary, in our overview of network security, we found that security fell into 4 different levels, or to 5 different categories: login security, file security, network or over-the-wire security, internetwork security, and physical security. And our job as a technician is to mitigate those threats to security. And this concludes our section on security.